Since I've already done videos ranking phases 1 and 2 of the MCU, my original plan for this video was to do just a phase 3 ranking, but when looking at my overall rankings I decided I might as well go ahead and instead stop and rank all 23 movies in the MCU from the worst to the best. Hi, my name is Andy and welcome back to my channel where I share my takes on the movies that I watch. If you also love talking movies, consider subscribing down below so that you don't miss any of my future reviews or other content. Also, before I give you my ranking of the MCU movies, go ahead and comment down below what your ranking of the movies are. I don't just want to share my opinions, I want to hear yours too. But with that said, let's get started. Coming in at number 23 is Thor: The Dark World. A follow-up to Thor, this movie tried to be one of the most serious and dark-toned movies in the MCU, but I think a few story elements were lost along the way. In particular, Malekith is kind of one of the most boring and least fleshed out villains, as all we really know about his storyline is that the Dark Elves want the Ether. The movie overall is so dark that it's kind of hard to get invested in. Coming in at number 22 is The Incredible Hulk. This movie is often regarded as the black sheep of the MCU, especially with the fact that Edward Norton was replaced after this movie with Mark Ruffalo. That said, I think Edward Norton does a good job playing Bruce Banner in an interesting story about Bruce trying to find a way to cure the Hulk. But with that said, it definitely is one of the slower movies in the MCU. Throughout it, there are about 3 really good action scenes, but between those scenes, their slow, serious toned story kinda dragged out. Coming in at number 21 is Iron Man 2. This movie is one that kind of frustrates me because I think it has elements of a movie that I could have potentially loved. And I think it does set up things really well. Whether you're talking about the storylines with Tony's health problems, whether you're talking about the introduction of Black Widow, but the more that they set up storylines, the less that they can focus on them. You have 2 different villains whose storylines they tried to connect in a way that didn't quite work. You have this whole subplot about Nick Fury coming in that's obviously just a setup for the Avengers, and so much happens that it just falls flat in the end. Coming in at number 20 is Thor. This movie actually used to be second from the bottom on my list, but it's grown on me a little bit through a couple rewatches as I think it does a good job at the world building that it has to do. And I think it does a good job of establishing Asgard as a planet and who these characters are throughout. The Shakespearean feel of the movie definitely helps with that. That said, the parts of the movie that happen on Asgard are far more entertaining than the parts that happen on Earth. Even when Thor is on Earth, I find myself more invested in Loki's storyline on Asgard of him trying to take the position of king as Thor is no longer on the planet and Odin is on his deathbed. Coming in at number 19 is Avengers: Age of Ultron. This movie kinda suffered from trying to just be a bigger version of the first Avengers movie. You have a far less compelling villain in Ultron than you did in Loki. Also, with this movie, it kinda turns me off a little bit that they killed Quicksilver off in the same movie that they introduced him just to try to show that there can be stakes in this universe. That said, there are definitely still some fun moments in this movie, and it's still fun to see all the main characters together. Coming in at number 18 is Captain America: The First Avenger. I think the first part of this movie is actually one of the more interesting backstories that we have gotten in the MCU. It's kind of fun to see what Steve was like in this time period, and I especially enjoy revisiting this movie and seeing what Steve and Bucky's friendship was kind of like before the future events of the MCU happened to them. I also just really like the concept of the backstory of someone wanting to do something that they're really not qualified for, but they're so passionate about it that they keep trying. I think this movie suffers a little bit once it gets past the backstory. For one, I think Red Skull is a good villain, but I feel like his story kind of feels like this disconnected story that really only becomes Steve's problem at the end. Coming in at number 17 is Doctor Strange. This movie is kind of fun because it introduces magic to the MCU, and Benedict Cumberbatch does a great job playing this doctor who's in a tough situation and just wants to find a way to fix it. I think this movie is an enjoyable movie, but it's also a very formulaic movie, and I feel like it's one that kind of suffers from that, especially with the villains not being very well fleshed out in this story. I definitely think this movie has some of the best visual effects in the entire MCU, and I really like watching it for that aspect. Coming in at number 16 is Spider-Man Homecoming. This is a really fun entry into the MCU because it takes us to a high school setting, which definitely gives it a different feel. And it's kind of fun to see what feels like a very natural high school setting and characters that you believe are in high school. Definitely the best thing about this movie for me is Michael Keaton as the Vulture. He is absolutely one of the best villains in the MCU. The one thing about this movie that doesn't quite work for me, though, is the fact that it feels like the entire story is centered around Peter's immaturity. It ends up being about him wanting so badly to go on more missions, and in the process he keeps disobeying everything that Tony and other adults in the situations are trying to protect him against. On top of that, there's really not much memorable for action in this movie, which is kind of surprising. Coming in at number 15 is Captain Marvel. The first female-led movie in the MCU is definitely a fun one, especially because you get to go back to the 1990s and because you get to see a younger version of Nick Fury. Also, I just kind of like some of the concepts and ideas of Carol's backstory. That said, the problem I have with it is kind of its structure. Since the story is focused on this woman who doesn't know anything about her life up until 6 years ago, and she's only being slowly reminded of it throughout the movie, we only get to learn things as she does, and sometimes it doesn't feel like that quite works. Coming in at number 14 is Ant-Man. This is definitely one of the funniest franchises within the MCU, as Paul Rudd as Scott Lang was great casting, and a lot of the side characters are really funny as well, especially Michael Pena as Luis. I also just really enjoy the father-daughter storylines, and I definitely think that's something that makes me like this movie quite a bit. But the one reason that this movie does fall flat to me is a lot of the stuff with the villain just felt like a whole Iron Man copy. Coming in at number 13 is Captain America the Winter Soldier. Probably the best thing about this movie to me is that it's actually such a different movie from the first Captain America movie, but it works quite well in doing so. It's really fun to see this whole government storyline. And it's definitely fun to see Steve and Natasha's friendship. And this movie introduces Sam Wilson, who has easily become one of my favorite MCU characters. The thing that holds this one back for me is that there's actually just some storylines and plot points throughout that have never quite made sense or quite worked for me. Especially for me, the whole Nick Fury fake death storyline has never quite made sense. Coming in at number 12 is Iron Man. The movie that started it all made a great decision in casting Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark. You get to know what Tony's going to be like within the first 5 minutes of this movie. And overall, it's just a really nice introduction to this franchise, and you can still see how it set the tone for the whole franchise to come. Also, a lot of people criticize the villain in this movie, but not counting the Avengers, I definitely think that it had the most interesting villain storyline of the first phase of the MCU. The only reason I'm not quite on board with people who still think this is top tier MCU is because I've always felt that you can kind of tell how heavily improvised it was. Coming in at number 11 is Black Panther. When it comes to world building, I definitely think this movie does it well, as you really get to know Wakanda as a place and the culture within it. Also, I think this movie has my favorite cast in the MCU. I pretty much like every single casting choice in this movie. Whether you're talking about Chadwick Boseman as T'Challa, who's one of my favorite leads in the MCU, or you're talking about Michael B. Jordan as Killmonger, who's one of my favorite villains in the MCU, or all of the other supporting cast who are all great. I do think this movie suffers a little bit from predictability, especially the fact that no one is actually gonna think that T'Challa died early on in the movie that he's the lead of. Coming in at number 10 is Captain America Civil War. This movie definitely has a lot of great things about it. Of course, you have the introductions of T'Challa and Peter Parker, and also you have some good character back and forth as they argue about whether they should sign these accords or whether they shouldn't. There's also obviously a lot of great action in this movie, and I just never fully bought that this would be their solution. Maybe for a couple of the main people, but like not everyone completely makes sense to me why they're on the side they're on, or why they think that fighting each other is the way to solve this. And especially the fact that Peter Parker and Scott Lang are really only on their sides because of who recruited them to the fight just feels kind of off to me and just feels like it goes against the purpose of why they're fighting in the first place. Coming in at number 9 for me is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. I definitely have a fun time with this movie, as I've already grown to love these characters in the first movie, and you get to see more of that here. And honestly, there's a couple characters such as Nebula and Yondu who I didn't necessarily care for as much in the first movie that have some great moments in this movie. I also definitely love Baby Groot in this movie, and I thought that was a great way to follow up what happened in the first movie. Kurt Russell also does a great job as Ego in this movie, and he's definitely one of the villains in the MCU that I like more. The one thing that doesn't quite work as well for me in this movie as it does in the first movie is the comedy. While I found pretty much all of the comedy in the original great, this one is a lot more hit and miss for me, and some of it even felt unnecessary. Coming in at number 8 is Ant-Man and the Wasp. The thing that I definitely like about this movie is that the Wasp gets a more centered role. Also, I just kind of find this movie a little bit funnier. I definitely like the ongoing gag about the truth serum. Also, I actually really like the storyline about all of these different characters in the story all trying to get after the same lab. I think that actually ties these different storylines in together better than some of the other movies that have multiple storylines going on in them. Also, I get why people say that Ghost isn't really a villain in the MCU, but she's still one of my favorite antagonists in the MCU because I really like her story, and I really get why she needs to do what she does in this movie. Coming in at number 7 is Iron Man 3. A lot of people argue that this is a better Shane Black movie than it is an MCU movie. And while I get what they mean by that, it doesn't really lessen my enjoyment of the movie, as I think Shane Black did a great job crafting a story that fit Tony's character really well. I definitely think this has a great depiction of Tony's mental illness problems and the struggles that he's going through. I also really love the storyline with him and Harley, and I think that's a great side of Tony to see in this movie. I also really enjoyed Pepper's storyline in this movie, and kind of getting to see her fight at the end in the last battle scene. Coming in at number 6 is Thor Ragnarok. This movie took the Thor franchise and completely turned it on its head by making a comedic movie. Other than Black Panther, I think I would say this movie has one of my favorite casts in the MCU, but it also introduces some great characters with Tessa Thompson as Valkyrie, Jeff Goldblum as the Grand Master, and also Kate Blanchett as Hela, who is one of the best performed villains in the MCU. I also just really love a lot of the story elements through this story, and I definitely like the way Hulk was used in this. Coming in at number 5 is Spider-Man Far From Home. The latest entry in the MCU had the difficult task of following up the events of Infinity War and Endgame and making sense of where the MCU is going to go next. And I think this movie did a great job of that overall. I also think Tom Holland really shined in this role, even more so than I think he has before. Jake Gyllenhaal as Mysterio was also a great casting decision in this movie. I also really like the comedic aspects of the movie in the first third of the movie, and then I like how it kind of takes a turn to come into more of the spy story thing. Coming in at number 4 is Avengers Endgame. This movie did a great job of basically being a finale to a 22 movie series. There is a lot of great storylines within this movie, and I love the way it tied in all the other movies, whether you're going back and visiting those other movies or just had the subtle references to them. And it definitely had a lot of emotional payoff throughout. Two things that do hold this movie back from being in my top 3 is one, that I do think it was a bit overly long, and I definitely think you can feel that in the middle act of the movie. And also, the comedic attempts in this movie were actually pretty hit or miss for me, in ways that I might not actually expect. Coming in at number 3 is The Avengers. The impressive thing about this movie is that they had established 4 different solo franchises, and then they brought them all together, trying to combine the characters and the tones of their own solo franchises, and somehow it worked. I still think this movie has some of the best character meetings of each other in the whole franchise, and some of the best banter back and forth between them. And there's also just some great moments for each of the original 6 Avengers in this movie. Coming in at number 2 for me is Avengers Infinity War. I think this one is one of the most impressive, as it has the most characters to balance throughout the story, and it also has a pretty great mix of story and comedy throughout the movie. I like seeing all of the introductions of the characters into this movie, and seeing how they're all going to mix into the story. I also really like the fact that Thanos is arguably the main character of this movie. It's kind of his story, and he's definitely the best villain the MCU has had to date. But coming in at number 1 for me is still Guardians of the Galaxy. In a way, this is kind of a team-up movie too, just of characters that we didn't actually know beforehand. But this is the kind of story that I really like. You have all these different characters who are funny or unique in their own way, and they're brought together for some main goal, and they work really well together. I like the dynamics between all of the different characters, and I like all of the characters for their own distinct reasons. I also think this is still what I would consider the funniest movie in the MCU, but that might be partially because it just lines up with my exact sense of humor. So that's why it is my number 1. If you liked this ranking, be sure to like this video, and don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss any of my other future reviews or future content. Thank you for tuning into this video and supporting my channel.